Hello everyone. Tonight, we walk the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London, where gaslight casts dancing shadows on wet cobblestones, and the desperate huddle in doorways against the cold, where children no older than 5 sell matches on street corners, where women sell the only thing they have left to sell, where the lost and forgotten disappear into the darkness, and no one notices they are gone. You might imagine Victorian London as Dickensian charm, as Sherlock Holmes mysteries, as gentlemen in top hats and ladies in But tonight, set that romantic vision aside. You are not walking down a safe, well-lit boulevard. You are in the rookeries, the slums, the places where respectable people never venture. You are among the lost souls, the ones who fell through every crack in society, the ones who haunt the gaslit shadows because they have nowhere else to go. So, before we descend into London's underworld, take a moment to like the video if these dark historical journeys speak to you, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Now, settle in, find that place of comfort. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the present fade like fog at dawn. There is nothing you need to do. Only listen to the voices from the shadows. Listen to the stories of those who were forgotten. Take a deep breath, release your hold on the now, and let me tell you about the lost souls of London's streets. The London of the 1880s and 1890s was the largest city the world had ever seen. Over 5 million people crammed into an urban sprawl that stretched for miles in every direction from the ancient heart of the city. It was the capital of the British Empire, the wealthiest and most powerful empire on earth. Its docks received goods from every corner of the globe. Its banks financed enterprises on 6 continents. Its streets were lit by tens of thousands of gas lamps, making it the most brilliantly illuminated city in history. London was modernity incarnate, progress made visible, civilization at its apex. But that same London, that same streets, that same modernity, concealed within itself a darkness that shocked even those who thought they understood poverty. Because Victorian London was not one city, but 2 cities, existing side by side, occupying the same physical space, but separated by an unbridgeable chasm of wealth and opportunity. There was the London of the West End, of Mayfair and Belgravia, of elegant squares and grand mansions, of theatres and restaurants and shops displaying goods from around the world. And there was the London of the East End, of Whitechapel and Spitalfields, of narrow alleys and crumbling tenements, of hunger and disease and desperation. The division was not merely economic, but geographical and psychological. Respectable Londoners rarely ventured east of Aldergate. They had no reason to. Everything they needed was in the West, and the stories they heard about the East End confirmed their prejudices and their fear. It was a place of crime, of vice, of foreigners, of people who had failed at life and deserved their fate. It was othered, made foreign, treated as if it were not part of the same city at all. But hundreds of thousands of people lived in the East End. They were born there, worked there, when work could be found, struggled to survive there, and died there, often young. They were not monsters or aliens, but human beings trying to live with dignity in circumstances that made dignity nearly impossible. And among them, the most vulnerable, were those who had lost even the minimal stability of a regular dwelling. Those who slept rough, who sheltered in doorways and under bridges, who haunted the streets because they had nowhere else to go. The lost souls of London. To understand how someone ended up on the streets, you must understand the precariousness of working-class life in Victorian London. There was no safety net, no unemployment insurance, no welfare state. If you could not work, for whatever reason, you did not eat. If you could not pay rent, you were evicted. There was no grace period, no negotiation. The system was ruthless, and work was uncertain. The London economy ran on casual labor. Dock workers gathered each morning hoping to be selected for a day's work. If you were not chosen, you earned nothing that day. Factory workers could be laid off without notice when orders declined. Domestic servants, the largest category of employment for women, could be dismissed for the slightest infraction, or for no reason at all, and turned out without a reference, making it nearly impossible to find other work. Illness was a financial catastrophe. If you were too sick to work, you had no income. Medical care cost money that most people did not have. A simple infection could become a death sentence, not because it could not be treated, but because treatment was unaffordable. And if the breadwinner of a family fell ill or died, the entire family could be plunged into destitution overnight. So the descent into homelessness was often sudden. A man loses his job, he cannot pay rent, He and his family are evicted. They try to stay with relatives or friends, but those people are themselves barely surviving and cannot support additional mouths. The family fragments. The man goes to look for work, sleeping rough. His wife tries to keep the children together, but cannot feed them and herself. She places the children in a workhouse, temporarily she hopes, and goes on the streets to survive. The children, if they are old enough, run away from the workhouse and take their chances on the streets. This was not an uncommon story. It happened every day in Victorian London. Families were torn apart by poverty, by the impossibility of survival on the wages that were offered, by the complete absence of any social support. And once you were on the streets, once you had lost that minimal foothold in respectable society, climbing back up was nearly impossible. Because to get work, you needed an address, clean clothes, references. If you were sleeping rough, you had none of these. You could not keep clean. Your clothes became ragged. You had no way to prove you were reliable. Employers would not hire you. Landlords would not rent to you. You were trapped in a vicious circle, where the fact of being homeless made it impossible to stop being homeless, and so you survived however you could. You begged, though begging was technically illegal and police would move you along or arrest you. You scavenged, picking through rubbish heaps for anything of value. You did odd jobs, casual labor so marginal it barely qualified as employment. You stole, if you were desperate enough and willing to risk prison, or you sold your body, the last resort, the thing that required no capital except yourself. The streets of London at night were crowded with these lost souls. They gathered in doorways, seeking shelter from wind and rain. They huddled over grates where warm air rose from bakeries and workshops below. They constructed crude shelters in parks and wastelands, which police would periodically tear down. They moved constantly, driven on by authorities, by property owners, by respectable citizens who did not want to see them, who were disturbed by visible poverty, who believed that homelessness was a moral failing rather than an economic inevitability. And the children, dear God, the children. Thousands of children lived on London's streets. Some were orphans, their parents dead from disease or accident. Some had been abandoned, left by parents who could not feed them. Some had run away from abusive homes or from the workhouse. Some had been born on the streets to mothers who were themselves homeless. These street children formed a distinct subculture. They had their own slang, their own survival strategies, their own social hierarchies. They slept in groups for warmth and safety. They worked together, some begging, some selling small items like matches or flowers, some picking pockets, some acting as lookouts or messengers for adult criminals. They were streetwise beyond their years, hardened by necessity, yet still children, still vulnerable, still desperate for affection and stability they rarely found. Charles Dickens had written about such children in Oliver Twist, published in the 1830s. 50 years later, they were still there, still struggling, still dying young. Because despite Dickens's fame, despite the shock and sympathy his novels generated, despite the growing awareness among some reformers that child poverty was a social problem requiring social solutions, very little had actually changed. Victorian society was willing to express concern but unwilling to spend money or challenge the economic system that produced such poverty. The workhouse system, established by the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, was supposed to provide a safety net for the destitute, but it was deliberately designed to be punitive, to discourage people from seeking help. Conditions in workhouses were harsh. Families were separated, men housed separately from women, children from parents. Inmates wore uniforms and performed monotonous labor like breaking rocks or picking oakum. The food was minimal and of poor quality. Discipline was strict. The entire system was designed on the principle of less eligibility. The idea that conditions in the workhouse should be worse than the worst conditions outside, so that only the truly desperate would seek admission. This principle was based on the assumption that poverty was a moral failing, that people were poor because they were lazy or immoral, and that if you made poverty too comfortable, people would choose it rather than working. This assumption was false and cruel, but it was deeply embedded in Victorian thinking. It allowed the wealthy to believe that they deserved their wealth because they were morally superior, and that the poor deserved their poverty because they were morally inferior. So people avoided the workhouse if they possibly could. They would endure incredible hardship on the streets rather than enter what was called the spike. And this meant that many who needed help did not seek it. They suffered and died, rather than submit to the degradation of the workhouse. Among the street population, certain groups were particularly visible and particularly vulnerable. One such group was the crossing sweepers, usually children or elderly men, who swept horse manure and mud from street crossings so that respectable people could walk across without soiling their shoes. They would then solicit tips from those crossing. It was marginally better than outright begging because it involved providing a service, however minimal. Some crossing sweepers claimed particular crossings as their territory and would defend them against interlopers. Another visible group was the flower sellers, usually young women or girls, who sold small bouquets or individual flowers on street corners and outside theatres. Some of these were honest sellers, buying flowers wholesale at Covent Garden Market and reselling them at markup. But many were prostitutes using flower selling as a cover, a way to solicit without being quite so obvious. The flowers were more symbol than commodity. Match sellers were everywhere, particularly children. Matches were cheap to buy wholesale and could be sold individually for a small profit. A child selling matches on a cold night was a common sight, immortalized in Hans Christian Andersen's story The Little Match Girl, which perfectly captured the pathos of the situation. The child, cold and hungry, trying to sell matches to passers-by who hurried past, too busy or too indifferent to help. Then there were the mudlarks, usually children, who scavenged in the Thames at low tide, searching through the mud for anything of value: coal that had fallen from barges, copper, nails, rope, bits of metal, anything that could be sold. It was filthy, dangerous work. The mud was polluted with sewage and industrial waste. Children could get stuck and drown when the tide came in, but it provided a bare subsistence for those desperate enough to do it. Night soil men worked the even darker hours, collecting human waste from cesspits and privies. Bone pickers collected bones from slaughterhouses and butchers to be processed into fertilizer. Rag gatherers collected scraps of fabric to be recycled into cheap cloth. Purefinders collected dog feces to be used in tanning leather. These were the lowest of the low, the occupations that no one would do if they had any alternative. And then there were those who did not even have these marginal occupations, those who were too old, too sick, too damaged by life to work at all. They simply existed, huddled in doorways, slowly dying of cold and hunger and disease. They were the invisible ones, the ones passers-by literally did not see, trained themselves not to see, because acknowledging them would require acknowledging the failure of the social system. The streets themselves were dangerous, particularly after dark. Gas lamps provided illumination on main thoroughfares, creating those famous pools of light and shadow that feature in every Victorian melodrama. But side streets and alleys were dark, and even on lit streets, the gaslight was unreliable. Lamps would go out, either from mechanical failure or because someone had deliberately extinguished them. Criminals preferred darkness. And there was crime, certainly. Poverty breeds crime out of desperate necessity. Theft was common, from simple pickpocketing to violent robbery. Con games flourished. Prostitutes would rob their clients. Gangs controlled territories and extorted protection money from businesses. But the reality was more complicated than the respectable press suggested. Most poor people were not criminals. They were simply trying to survive, and they were far more likely to be victims of crime than perpetrators. Because the truly dangerous criminals in London were not the desperate poor, but the organized gangs. The professional criminals who saw crime as a business. And the most vulnerable to these criminals were the street dwellers who had no protection, no recourse to law, no way to defend themselves. Street women were particularly vulnerable. They could be robbed, beaten, raped, murdered, and who would investigate? Who would care? They were already outside society, already discounted, already halfway to being forgotten. This vulnerability became horrifyingly apparent in the autumn of 1888, when a series of murders terrorized the Whitechapel district. 5 women, all of them prostitutes, all of them poor, were killed in brutal fashion. The murders were shocking not because they were the only violence against street women. Violence against such women was common, but because they were so theatrical, so deliberately horrifying, because the killer was never caught, and because the press gave them unprecedented coverage. The victims, the canonical 5, as they came to be called, were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Edos, and Mary Jane Kelly. They ranged in age from 25 to 45. All of them had been married at some point. All of them had children. All of them had descended into homelessness and prostitution through combinations of alcohol, domestic violence, economic necessity, and sheer bad luck. Their lives were hard, their choices limited, their deaths brutal. And yet, what the press focused on was not their humanity, not the social conditions that had placed them in such desperate circumstances, but the sensational details of the murders and the identity of the killer. He was given a nickname, Jack the Ripper, which made him almost romantic, a dark figure of mystery. Theories proliferated about who he might be: a mad doctor, a foreign sailor, a member of the aristocracy. The speculation was endless. Meanwhile, the actual women, the victims, were largely forgotten. The press described them in dehumanizing terms, focused on their profession and their poverty rather than their personhood. They were just unfortunates, just prostitutes, their deaths tragic, but perhaps not surprising given how they lived. The implication was that they had placed themselves in danger, that their deaths were somehow their own fault. This victim blaming was typical of how Victorian society viewed street women. Prostitution was illegal but tolerated, regulated through the Contagious Diseases Acts, which required women suspected of prostitution to undergo invasive medical examinations for venereal disease. Men who used their services faced no such requirements. The double standard was blatant. Women were blamed for prostitution while the men who created demand for it were not. And the women engaged in prostitution not because they enjoyed it, though the press often implied they were immoral women who had chosen vice over virtue, but because they had no alternative. They needed money for food and shelter. Prostitution required no training, no capital, no employer willing to hire you. It was the option of last resort for women who had exhausted all others. The typical street prostitute in Victorian London was not the glamorous courtesan of literature. She was a desperate woman in her 30s or 40s, worn out by hard living, selling herself for pennies, just enough to pay for a bed in a doss house, a 4-penny coffin, as the cheapest beds were called because they were narrow wooden boxes that resembled coffins. If she could not earn 4pence, she slept on the street, which meant she was vulnerable not only to the weather but to violence. The murders committed by Jack the Ripper, whoever he was, highlighted this vulnerability. But they also revealed the contempt with which society viewed these women. The police investigation was hampered by the fact that no one had seen anything suspicious, because everyone in Whitechapel was suspicious looking. The neighborhood was so poor, so desperate, that violence and strangeness were normal, and the victims were women whose movements were not tracked, whose absence was not immediately noticed, who could disappear and no one would know for days. After the Ripper murders, there was brief interest in the conditions of the poor. Reformers and journalists ventured into the East End to document the poverty. Thomas Bernardo, already running homes for destitute children, expanded his efforts. The Salvation Army increased its outreach. Philanthropists donated money for shelters and soup kitchens. But the interest faded. London's poor were a perennial problem, and perennial problems ceased to shock. What would have genuinely helped would have been systemic change. Living wages, affordable housing, healthcare, education, legal protection, political representation. But these required challenging the economic and political system that benefited the wealthy. So instead, Victorian reformers offered charity, which salved their consciences without threatening their privileges. Some reformers did push for deeper change. The Fabian Society, founded in the 1880s, advocated for socialism, for collective ownership and democratic control of the economy. Charles Booth conducted massive surveys of London poverty, producing detailed maps showing the economic status of every street, demonstrating that poverty was not a moral failing but a structural problem. These efforts laid groundwork for later reforms, but in the Victorian period they achieved little concrete change. Meanwhile, the lost souls continued their nightly wandering through gaslit streets. They developed their own culture, their own ethics, their own community. There was solidarity among the street dwellers, a sense that they were all in this together, that they needed to look out for each other, because no one else would. They shared information about where to find food, where police were conducting raids, which landlords were more forgiving, which charities were giving out soup. They had their own geography, their own intimate knowledge of London, that no respectable person possessed. They knew every doorway deep enough to shelter from wind, every grate that vented warm air, every public toilet where you could wash, at least minimally, every park where police were less likely to roust you, every soup kitchen and its hours, every church that left its doors unlocked. This knowledge was survival. They also had their own economy. Items were traded, favors exchanged. Someone with a knife might cut hair for a few pennies. Someone with needle and thread might mend clothes. Someone with a strong back might carry loads. Someone with literacy might write or read letters. These informal exchanges created networks of mutual support that were essential to survival. And there was entertainment. Street performers, buskers, were everywhere. Musicians with worn instruments, acrobats, jugglers, puppeteers, storytellers. They performed for pennies thrown by passers-by, but they also performed for each other, for the community of the streets. There were pubs, of course, where even the poorest could sometimes scrape together pennies for a drink, and where news was exchanged and stories told. The public houses of the East End were not the respectable establishments of the West End. They were rough, crowded, loud, often violent, but they were also community centres, places where working people and street people could gather, could feel part of something larger than their individual struggle. The pub was warm when the street was cold. It offered temporary respite, temporary forgetting. Alcohol was both comfort and curse for London's poor. It dulled hunger, cold, and despair. But it also consumed money that could have bought food, and it trapped people in cycles of addiction that made their situations worse. The temperance movement, which advocated for abstinence from alcohol, was strong in Victorian Britain. But while its diagnosis of alcohol as a problem was correct, its solution, moral exhortation to stop drinking, ignored the reasons why people drank, the desperation and hopelessness that made oblivion attractive. Some of the lost souls had more complex stories, more dramatic descents. There were people who had once been respectable, even wealthy, and had fallen through tragedy or bad luck. A businessman whose business failed. A professional who became addicted to opium. A widow whose husband left debts she could not pay. A young man from a good family who was disowned for some scandal. These people carried with them the memory of better times, which sometimes made their current situation harder to bear. And there were those who had never known anything but poverty. Born in the slums, raised in the workhouse, turned out at 14 to make their own way, with no skills and no prospects. For them, the streets were not a fall, but simply a continuation of the only life they had ever known. They might be better adapted to survival, having never expected anything different, but they were no less desperate. Children born on the streets, or who came to them very young, often did not survive to adulthood. Disease was rampant. Malnutrition stunted growth and weakened immune systems. Accidents were common, and there was always the danger of being pressed into criminal activity by adults who exploited them. Yet some did survive, growing into street-smart adults who knew no other world, who would raise their own children on the streets, perpetuating cycles of poverty across generations. The lost souls were not only English. London attracted migrants from across Britain and beyond. Irish immigrants fleeing famine and poverty. Eastern European Jews fleeing pogroms. Lascars, sailors from India and Southeast Asia, who jumped ship in London and found themselves stranded. Chinese sailors and workers, forming small communities in Lighthouse. This diversity was greatest in the East End, creating a cosmopolitan poverty, a mixing of cultures that respectable London found threatening. Foreigners were scapegoated, blamed for crime and poverty, accused of taking jobs from English workers. This xenophobia was particularly strong during economic downturns, when competition for scarce work intensified. Foreign street dwellers faced additional challenges, language barriers and discrimination on top of all the other obstacles they faced. Yet within this diversity there was often solidarity. People who shared language or culture would help each other, and sometimes alliances formed across ethnic lines, based on shared circumstance rather than shared background. Poverty was a great equalizer, creating bonds between people who might otherwise never have interacted. Some of those who ended up on the streets had been broken by institutions that were supposed to help them. Veterans of Britain's colonial wars, men who had served in India or Afghanistan or Africa, who came home damaged, physically or psychologically, and found no support. They had fought for empire, but empire had no use for them once they could no longer fight. They ended up begging on the streets, sometimes wearing their old uniforms, displaying their medals, trading on whatever sympathy might be evoked by their service. Others had passed through prisons, emerging with criminal records that made employment nearly impossible. Victorian prisons were brutal, designed to punish rather than rehabilitate. Men and women emerged from them traumatized, institutionalized, less capable of functioning in society than when they entered. They often returned to crime, not because they were inherently criminal, but because they had no other options, leading to cycles of incarceration and release that consumed entire lives. The mentally ill were particularly vulnerable. Britain had asylums, but they were overcrowded and underfunded. Many mentally ill people were simply left to wander, unable to care for themselves, easy prey for those who would exploit them. They muttered to themselves, acted strangely, frightened passers-by, who saw them as threatening rather than as people in need of help. Some were violent, yes, made dangerous by their illness and by the lack of treatment, but most were simply lost, confused, trying to navigate a world that made no sense to them and that had no place for them. And then there were the elderly, people who had worked all their lives but who had not been able to save for old age because their wages were so low. When they could no longer work, when their strength gave out, they had nothing. No pension, no savings, no family able to support them. They ended up on the streets, too old to work, too proud to beg effectively, slowly fading away. It is difficult to convey the sheer scale of the problem. Thousands of people on London's streets every night. Not the same thousands, the population was fluid. People moved in and out of homelessness as circumstances changed. But always thousands, always a substantial population of the lost and desperate. And this was just London. Every industrial city in Britain had similar problems. Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, Glasgow, all had their rookeries and their street populations. And beyond Britain, every industrializing nation was creating similar urban poor. This was not a uniquely British problem, but a product of industrial capitalism, of the way that system concentrated wealth and created poverty, of the way it treated human beings as disposable labor. Some observers recognized this. Friedrich Engels, living in Manchester in the 1840s, wrote about the condition of the working class in England, describing the poverty and squalor in damning detail. Karl Marx, working in the British Museum reading room, developed his critique of capitalism, partly based on what he could see on London's streets. These analyses pointed toward revolution, toward fundamental transformation of the economic system. But Britain did not have a revolution. It had reforms, slow and grudging reforms, that ameliorated the worst conditions without fundamentally changing the system. The extension of suffrage, giving more men, and eventually women, the vote. The introduction of basic labor protections, the beginning of a welfare state. These changes came over decades, often only after intense political pressure from labor unions and socialist movements. And through all of this, through all the political debates and reform movements and moral panics and official inquiries, the lost souls continued their existence in the gaslight shadows. They were studied by sociologists, written about by journalists, preached at by missionaries, policed by constables, ignored by most people most of the time. Some individuals tried to help in direct, personal ways. Thomas Bernardo, whose homes for destitute children eventually housed thousands. William Booth, founder of the Salvation Army, who provided both spiritual comfort and practical aid, like soup kitchens and shelters. Octavia Hill, housing reformer who tried to provide decent affordable housing. These were genuine humanitarians, motivated by compassion and faith, who devoted their lives to helping the poor. But even they could not solve the problem, because the problem was structural. As long as the economic system produced poverty, as long as there was no safety net, as long as wages were too low and work too scarce and housing too expensive, there would be lost souls on the streets. Individual charity could alleviate suffering but could not eliminate its causes, and some of the help offered came with strings attached. Religious missions required attendance at services in exchange for meals. Charities investigated the deserving versus undeserving poor, helping those who could prove they were trying to improve themselves but turning away those deemed morally suspect. This moral categorization was cruel and counterproductive, withholding help from those who most needed it based on judgments about their character. The workhouse remained the official solution, and its existence allowed those who wanted to ignore the problem to claim that anyone truly destitute could seek help there. Never mind that the workhouse was deliberately punitive. Never mind that families were separated. Never mind that conditions were intentionally harsh. The existence of this option, however inadequate, allowed the comfortable to believe they had done their duty. As the century drew to a close, there were some improvements. Housing reform led to slum clearance and the construction of model dwellings, though these often displaced the poor without providing alternatives they could afford. Public health measures improved sanitation, reducing disease. Education became compulsory, at least giving children some tools for eventual escape from poverty. But progress was slow and uneven, and into the early 20th century, poverty and homelessness remained features of British urban life. The lost souls of one generation gave way to the lost souls of the next, the faces changing but the circumstances remaining grimly similar. World War I created new categories of lost souls, men shattered by the trenches who came home unable to adjust to civilian life. The interwar period saw economic depression that threw millions out of work. World War II brought bombing and destruction, but also, paradoxically, a sense of shared sacrifice that led to more generous social provision afterward. The post-war welfare state, created by the Labour government of 1945, was in many ways a response to the poverty documented in Victorian London. Universal healthcare through the National Health Service, unemployment insurance, state pensions, public housing, free education. These programs did not eliminate poverty, but they prevented the absolute destitution that had characterized Victorian streets. Yet homelessness never disappeared. Even in the welfare state, some people fall through the cracks. Mental illness, addiction, family breakdown, bad luck, these still drive people onto the streets. And in recent decades, with the retrenchment of the welfare state, with rising housing costs and stagnant wages and the fraying of the social safety net, street homelessness has increased again in Britain and elsewhere. So the gaslight shadows have electric light now, but the lost souls remain. The details have changed, but the essential story continues. People without homes, without stability, without the resources needed for survival, trying to get through one more night, one more day, existing on the margins of prosperous societies that would prefer not to see them. The lessons of Victorian London are not merely historical, they are ongoing. They remind us that prosperity and poverty coexist, that the comforts enjoyed by some depend on systems that immiserate others, that poverty is not a personal failing but a social failure, that addressing it requires not just charity but justice, not just kindness but structural change. They remind us too of human resilience, of the capacity to endure incredible hardship, to maintain dignity in community in circumstances designed to strip both away. The lost souls of London's streets were not just victims but people with agency and creativity and connection, people who found ways to survive and even to help each other survive. Their stories matter, not as sentimentalized tales of suffering to make the comfortable feel sympathy, not as moral lessons about the dangers of vice or the rewards of virtue, but as testimony to what it means to be human at the edge of survival, to the choices people make when all options are bad, to the bonds formed in desperation, to the knowledge that is gained through suffering. And so the gaslight flickers on the wet cobblestones. The fog rolls in from the Thames. A child huddles in a doorway, trying to sell the last of her matches. A woman stands on a corner, waiting. An old man sleeps on a grate, grateful for the rising warmth. A group of young men share a bottle, their laughter echoing down the empty street. The city sleeps uneasily, the respectable behind locked doors, the desperate wherever they can find shelter. And in the morning, the streets will be full again. Carts and carriages will rattle past. Merchants will open shops. Workers will hurry to their jobs. The mechanisms of commerce and industry will resume, and the lost souls will melt back into the shadows, invisible again until night falls and they emerge once more, ghosts haunting the gaslit margins of the great city. Let that image fade now. Let the fog dissipate. Let the gaslight dim. Rest now in warmth and safety, knowing that such things were not always available, are not available to all even now. Breathe easily. Close your eyes. Let the lost souls of London return to history, remembered but no longer suffering. And rest. Rest deeply. Dream of better worlds, of cities where no one is lost, where every soul has shelter and dignity. And sleep. The streets are quiet now, the shadows are still, and you can sleep.